In this episode, we focus on Kwentong Kultura, or stories of culture. Our guests will discuss how climate change shapes and threatens Filipino culture and how the climate crisis imperils our Filipino traditions and identity, including those of our indigenous groups. I am your host, Kato, Sarmiento, Communications Manager at the OML Center. Joining our conversation are Dr. Noralene Uy, Climate and Disaster Risk Management Specialist, who has done extensive research on, among others, indigenous knowledge and community resilience. Team Bintuwak, represented by Ronald Maliao, Richard Cahilig, and Ritchel Cahilig, who are a group of communicators that has sought to enhance the understanding and appreciation for indigenous knowledge systems and practices, or IKSP, in riverine conservation of Nabaoynons in Malay Aklan. And Robert Mansalo-on Cahapon is co-founder of Salumayag Youth Collective for Forests and is a member of the Manobo Kulamanun indigenous community in southern Bukidnon. Doc Lenny, let's kick off the episode. The Philippines is known for its rich and diverse culture. How is climate change impacting our traditions and culture? What impacts are studies showing?
Thank you very much, Kato, and thank you for the organizers for this invitation to join this episode of Ang Ating Klima. So I will respond to your questions with this presentation, if you would just allow me to pull up my presentation. So today I'll be setting the tone for this conversation and hopefully just touch on the general views on what is happening now on the conversation about climate change and culture and how we can make indigenous knowledge relevant to the times. Next, please. So I'll be touching on indigenous knowledge systems and practices, but that other panelists, I will let our other panelists dwell on this some more. And I will be looking at the link between climate change and culture and the implications of a changing climate on culture. Next, please. So I would like to start with this folk lyric from the Ivatan because it shows clearly how the Ivatans live with risks and hazards. So from time immemorial, they have known how to live with storms, with rains, and so thus they have this folk lyric. So we can see, I will start with indigenous knowledge, and we can see that there are different related terminologies that can be found in literature. So it's known under several names, but they are all, they share common semantic load and address the same broad issues. So just a quick look at some definitions. So I would just like to highlight here that indigenous knowledge, it means that knowledge is already existing and is developed in a particular geographic area. So it has been developed over time and continues to be developed and tested. So it should be understood that indigenous knowledge is dynamic and changing. And also, indigenous knowledge has evolved through adaptive processes and has been handed down through generations. Next, please. So the main elements that we can find when we talk about indigenous knowledge is that the knowledge is specific to a context or an environment. So we can find some element of time, like I have mentioned, it has been tested over the years and over generations. It is community-based, or it has origins in the community, but it can also be influenced by external knowledge as well. So usually the dissemination comes in the form of non-formal methods. And then because it originates from the community usually has collective ownership of that knowledge. And also this type of knowledge would be practical. So you would look at indigenous knowledge as influencing livelihoods, their strategies on food security, on their habitation. So we can see all these things when we talk about indigenous knowledge. Next, please. So there are some examples, a lot actually, and our other panelists can also expand on this, on how indigenous knowledge is used with regards to risk reduction. So commonly, indigenous knowledge is used in terms of forecasting and early warning. So our indigenous communities know, just based on the weather patterns, when certain weather or season is coming. And also they look at the behavior of animals to predict some events that will be happening soon. And of course, there's also adaptation. So we can see here some traditional housing that has served the people in Batanes from being affected by typhoons. And also in terms of, again, food security strategies, they know how to till the land to preserve the soil, so they're able to contribute to food security in their community. Next, please. Now, just to link climate change and culture. So in the conversation on climate change culture, it's also recognized as one of the greatest threats facing us today. So the uprooting of communities due to climate change threatens entire ways of life. So this would impact on their practices and their heritage. So also oral traditions, their social practices, events, and again, traditional knowledge are all vulnerable in the face of climate change. So it can be eroded. It can be something that may not be working anymore because of the changing climate. And cultural heritage properties are already suffering from the impacts of climate change. So again, we see how our cultural heritage assets are affected by floods, by typhoons, by droughts. And finally, climate change also contributes to lost economic opportunities from cultural tourism and from income sources of our cultural and creative industries. Next, please. Now, culture is very important for addressing climate change. When we have natural heritage sites, they can also serve as sinks for greenhouse gas emissions, and also are key to protecting our biodiversity. As I have mentioned earlier, intangible cultural heritage practices have proven to be highly effective in helping communities in addressing disasters and climate change related events. So we can see these practices helping them towards coping mechanisms, towards ensuring food security and other adaptation actions. And lastly, cultural heritage sites can also serve as refuge, both in terms of physical and psychological dimensions when communities experience disasters. Next, please. So the current knowledge on climate change as it impacts on indigenous peoples have been focused by the IPCC. So recently with the IPCC AR6 report, we can see that IPCC recognizes indigenous knowledge as a valid form of knowledge in addressing the risk of climate change. So based on this report, some of the findings that they have mentioned is that sudden losses of food and access to food have affected indigenous communities in terms of decreasing health and through malnutrition. And also there's a loss of ecosystems and their services because of the impacts of this changing climate. And this affects indigenous knowledge because they are directly dependent on ecosystems to basic needs. And also, according to the IPCC, the cooperation and decision-making that is inclusive, that also include indigenous communities, would be important in addressing forest challenges, especially in coming up with adaptation strategies. And then finally, with regard to maladaptation, we can see that maladaptation practices in addressing climate change also affect indigenous people. And so only through inclusive planning, informed by the cultural heritage, cultural values and customs of indigenous peoples, can we be able to help prevent maladaptation in certain contexts. Next, please. Because of that, we have seen that there's increasing attention that's being given to indigenous knowledge in terms of risk reduction. So this is because risk reduction is a social issue, so it affects everyone, and also everyone has the capacity to contribute to risk reduction. And at this point where we see changing risk landscape, we have already observed intense impacts of climate changes. We really need to be able to understand what is happening on the ground, because our local people are the local experts, and they can see how better to address risk reduction at their level. So we should be able to see what are the hazards, what are the exposure, what are the vulnerability and adaptive capacity that is available on the ground to be able to address risks. And indigenous knowledge is also referred to as a resource, because it informs on how they look into livelihoods, in their food security decisions, and then finally, IK can also be a basis for local decision making, because it can inform what adaptation actions need to be done at the local level, informed by the knowledge of everyone in the community. Next, please. So there are arguments to using or not using indigenous knowledge in climate change and DRR. Of course, everyone would like to utilize indigenous knowledge because it has added value to the current strategies, be it especially in the scientific dimension. Indigenous knowledge increases community participation, empowers people, thereby making sure that everyone participates in climate actions. And then knowledge contained in IK can also improve implementation, because the community has ownership of this knowledge. The community can easily be able to implement actions. And then the last thing that we are arguing for the inclusion of IK is that dissemination of IK by non-formal education can provide a successful model for non-formal teaching and learning, thereby contributing to dissemination of indigenous knowledge to a wider group of people. Now, there are also arguments against the use of IK. They say with the changing climate, we can see now that there are different physical manifestations of hazards that may make indigenous knowledge irrelevant. And then also climate change creates new conditions or new realities which are beyond existing experience and memory, so which would require changes from the usual practice that our indigenous communities are doing. And also, we also find that there's continuous erosion and extinction of IK that they may not be able to be used when the time comes. Next, please. So what are the implications of a changing climate on culture? And here I would just like to highlight three points. Because of the changing climate, we need to engage indigenous communities So we need to be able to build an enabling environment through policy engagement and identifying champions at the community level, which can spearhead climate action on the ground. So we need to be able to integrate indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge, because a holistic approach in policy and practice should be undertaken. So in order to do this, we need to also acknowledge that only by combining both, we can have appropriate measures on the ground. And then finally, there's a need to promote exchanges and partnerships. So community-led actions need to be linked to the overall national, local, national, and even international platforms and frameworks to be able to share good practices and learning at a global level. And I will end with this last slide. So this is a recommendation from the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which aims to empower community leaders. So they urge community leaders to take a leadership role in local level development work, resilience building, and climate action. They should be able to undertake risk assessments, so self-assessments of risk, capacity, and vulnerability, to be able to identify new or recurrent hazards, and then also successful practices in terms of DRR and CCA, which can be used to be able to cope with these new hazards. And then also, if they could develop also integrated strategies that take advantage of both local knowledge and mainstream strategies, meaning also including scientific knowledge that are better adapted to the indigenous people's local concerns and resources that are available on the ground. So I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doc Lenny. It's interesting to me that you brought up the Ibatans, because I have always thought of Batanes as one of the most resilient communities in the Philippines. By sheer distance and geography, relief and recovery does not reach them immediately. So they have had to figure out how to fend for themselves on the assumption that national government cannot immediately come in to help them. But in your presentation, you've also raised a good point about the resilience of indigenous communities coming from a sense and pride of place, being able to balance traditions and modern development. Perhaps we can discuss that further with our other panelists later. For now, we turn to our storytellers and advocates. Can you please introduce yourselves and the work that you are doing at the intersection of climate change and culture? Ritchel?
Hi, everyone. I am Ritchel Cahilig, the climate communicator of Team Bintuwak. It's my honor to introduce our team. Team Bintuwak is a collaboration between Aklan Research Center for Coastal Studies, the Community Resilience and Environmental Education Development, or the CREED Foundation, and Aklan Trekkers. Our team is composed of environmental advocates and marine biology researchers who are all responsible mountaineers with various experiences in outreach missions. And we do share the passion for grassroots conservation and environmental education. And we also recognize the traditional climate coping strategies of riverine people, as well as their ability to manage freshwater ecosystems in a sustainable way, which we believe can reverse marginalization and provide adequate services and support. And to present to you our team composition, let me start with our team leader, Sir Ronald.
Thank you. My name is Ronald Maliao. I was the head and founder of Aklan Research Center for Coastal Studies, which is research institute based in Aklan State University in Aklan, Philippines. I am also the founder of the CREED Foundation, the Community Resiliency and Environmental Education Foundation based in the Philippines. I am a professor and a teacher in Aklan State University and the leader of the Team Bintuwak that actually won the Umalohokan grant last year in 2021. Thank you, Ma'am Ritchel.
Also with us today is my partner in life and co-founder of Aklan Trekkers, Richard.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Richard Cahilig. I am the field researcher of Team Bintuwak, and now I am working as a field team leader in an NGO in partnership with the Bristol Zoological Society. We're doing wildlife research in the Northwest Panay Peninsula Natural Park.
Thank you, Ritchel. So from the Batanes to Malay Aklan, we moved to Southern Bukidnon. Sir Robert.
Pasensya na hindi ko ma-on yung video ko kasi napaka-ulan dito sa amin. And so, ang grupo namin ay tinatawag na Salumayag Youth Collective for Forest. Isa itong maliit na grupo na nakabase sa komunidad, isang indigenous youth-led. May 4 kami na co-founder nito. 2 kaming tribal indigenous people galing sa Bukidnon, ang isa Higaonon, Marky, Elnar, and si Amor Paredes yung isa namin na co-founder na siya yung nagagawa ng mga proposals, documentations ng mga programs namin, and si Raisa Javier para sa aming graphics. And may 4 kami na tinututukan na program sa aming inisyatibo na ginagawa. Ito yung Forest and Farm Regeneration Initiative. Ikalawa is trainings and dialogues. Pangatlo ay ang environmental storytelling, and ang pang-4 is ang social enterprise. So sa Forest and Farm Regeneration Initiative na ginagawa namin, so ginagawa namin na in-engage namin yung community on na kumustahin kung kilala pa ba nila yung mga pananim na dito sa amin at kung paano namin susolusyonan yung degradation na nangyari dito sa amin. So may forest walk and farm walk kami na tinatawag at ginagawa namin. So dito dinadala namin yung mga tao, mga kabataan para ipakilala sa kanila na kung may connection pa ba tayo sa ating kinagisnan, sa gubat natin, sa lupa, sa tubig. So may 2 kaming youth volunteer na tinitrain namin na makapag-share din sila sa mga practices or sa mga programs na ginagawa namin. So ang isa is isang katutubo rin na nandito nakaugat mismo sa komunidad. So Ranil,
medyo nakat si Sir Robert. But I'm excited that we have a panel who will be able to discuss different indigenous groups and experiences. Perhaps we can start with, we say in the climate change space in the Philippines, what happens on one side of the mountain is different from what happens on the other side of the mountain. So the experiences of communities, especially indigenous communities from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, are really very varied. What would you say to you are good examples of indigenous community resilience?
Anyway, let me pitch in, Ma'am Kato, about that. Because for me, that question is academically very challenging and probably realistically hard to contextualize when you talk about resiliency. Now, in ecology and in science, we interpret resiliency as the capacity of the system to rebound back to its former state after a perturbation. But putting this terminology in social sense, there are a lot of different sectors that actually do not like the use of the term resiliency in the context of the people, because that signifies that you just have to return back to your previous state, devoid of adaptability. Well, that's, probably off topic. But to answer your question, probably a good example to demonstrate the capacity of local people to rebound back to their former state, as you said, resilient community. This is not in Bao'y, but my experience in Malalison Island. It's a small island off the coast of Pulasi and Tiki. Their island have been losing land cover. 15 years ago, it's a 56-hectare island. Recently, the measurement is now 54 because of change in the level of the sea and erosion. But then they were able to, adapt to this kind of perturbation by managing their corals, at the same time mixing hard technology using seawall, and at the same time putting artificial coral reef. And this has been implemented by the local government in collaboration with the local people, with the understanding that maintaining their coral reef habitat would be critical and crucial in the impact of climate change in the context of sea level rise. But whether they will be resilient in 10 to 10 years or 100 years is a different type of resilience. But this is a very good example in my end, how local community that are marginalized and actually vulnerable are actually adapting to the inevitable repercussion of climate change, at least in the context of Malalisan. And probably later, I would love to talk more about this community aside from our side on how local knowledge and local people are actually adjusting, probably not going back to their former state, but adapting to the changes of their environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald. Gusto kong balikan that idea of building back and moving forward, building forward. But you talked about the resilience of a coastal community. So, Robert, are you there? In Bukidnon, where it's more mountainous and forests, what would you say makes for a good example of community resilience? Robert, you're on mute.
I said, pasensya na kasi wala akong ilaw sa kubo ko. So, pasensya na talaga. Okay, sa Bukidnon naman na settings, paano naging resilient yung mga komunidad dito sa amin? Unang-una sa pagkain. Ano yung mga kinakain ng mga katutubo na kahit sa anong panahon is nag-adapt? So, ito yung mga root crops. So, sa mga root crops dito, kahit na may mga ilang bagyo pang dumaan, nagtatanim kayo ng mga kamote, ng saging, ng cassava. So ito yung mga siguro isa sa napaka-resilient na paraan na ginagawa ng aming komunidad na kahit sa ano pa mang kalamidad na paparating ay may mapagkukunan at may mapagkukunan pa rin ng pagkain. Yeah.
Salamat, Robert. That's why your group's advocacy is in trying to reforest and moving towards agroecology. That's correct. Mawalan man ng pera, basta may makain, okay na tayo, di ba? Doc Lenny.
Yes,
Doc Lenny, what are your thoughts on, like from all of your studies, what makes a good example of indigenous community resilience?
Thank you, Kato. I believe that they need to be able to understand their context in terms of risk, because as we have already mentioned, we now have a different risk landscape. So, like Sir Ronald mentioned, they should be able to learn, to adjust, to adapt their understanding or thinking, not basing on what they have been doing in the past, but being able to really adjust their ways of addressing the present and even future risks. So it should start from there, being able to really know what the risks they are facing and being able to come up with some strategies that hopefully will lead to resiliency in the future.
Thanks, Doc Lenny. So we mentioned earlier that there are two sides to when we talk about indigenous communities. Merong aspect of learning from our indigenous communities, and there's also the aspect of the vulnerability of our indigenous communities. And it seems to me from the inputs of Robert and Ronald, and even your example of the Ivatans, what makes a strong indigenous community is this sense and pride of place, because you've been there in that community for so long. You know the movement of the seasons, you know how the land breathes, and you're able to respond to all of these changes. So nabanggit natin yung bouncing back and moving forward, how to build stronger. Perhaps we can look at that. With climate change, and Noralene, Doc Lenny mentioned the changing climate risk landscape. What used to be the normal seasons anywhere in the country has changed, and some communities are no longer able to keep up with the changes. What do you think are the challenges that indigenous communities face with the climate change that we are experiencing? And how can they start moving towards not just recovering, but actually being able to thrive?
You're correct about the sense of place and their understanding of the circumstances and the situation that they're in. So, because things are changing, the climate is changing, I believe that there should be an intervention from outside that should be able to maybe start a conversation with them that things may be changing in the future, and that there may be a need to really start looking into some adjustments in the way of how you are looking at things, in your way of life, how we were able to adjust some of the strategies that you're doing now to be able to further improve your adaptive capacity and be able to better address these changed situation or new realities in the future. So I am for really integrating climate change, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge with scientific knowledge to be able to appropriately take action on what is currently or in the future would be happening. Because of if we don't look at the science, I'm not saying that local knowledge is not science, but if we do not really look at the science of things, I think we'll not be able to come up with really long-lasting solutions that will contribute to the well-being and resilience building of our indigenous communities.
Thanks, Doc Lenny. Sir Ronald, what's your perspective on this?
That and your previous question are related, so I will be mixing up my answers with the hope that Ritchel and Richard can pitch in, because I will be answering it through demonstration of actual experience in Nabaoy River and Nabaoy community. Now, indigenous community and local communities are really at the forefront of climatic battle, because the most vulnerable sector of the community that are sensitive to climatic events are those communities that are resource dependent, meaning they rely on their livelihood and income directly from the resources in the environment, and any perturbation and changes, will really affect this. And one very good example of this is the recent effects of the pandemic. Typhoon Haiyan, for example, these are all connected. Can be connected to climate change, and these are among the impacts that are palpable to the community now and will worsen in the future. And those are good, conversation on the impact of climate change and adaptation would be very practical to contextualize in these events because these are related to the impact of climate change. Now, going back to the Nabaoy in the research area, one dramatic effect that are being felt by the local community is the increasing number and extreme typhoon events that resulted to flooding. Okay, the rainy days are harder. The rainy season affecting their livelihood in many ways. Now, how do they cope up with these recent events, at least in the last 10 to 20 years in their recollection? Traditionally, they are fishing using traditional gears, but with the onset of frequent flooding at the same time, decline of their catch, one of their adaptation, and Richard and Ritchel are more familiar with this because they are really the one who immersed in the community, is to come up with some sort of aquaculture, wherein during summer, to augment their income from actual fishing, they sort of make this a small area alongside the river where they culture small fish that they caught from the river to make it bigger. And aside from this, their agro-system adaptation, wherein they use multiple cropping that is resistant to drought, for example. One of adaptation in local communities with regards to changing climate. So there are many, concrete examples wherein local communities are trying to come up with solution with what they perceive as changing in the environment. Now, example of this is frequent flooding in the river, more extensive drought. So, as Sir Robert have mentioned, the most important component in their survival is to ensure that there is food in the table. And this is probably, in this context, a very good way to look at how community are trying to be resilient, building resiliency in the context of food security. Rachel, can you expound more on that aquaculture in Nabawe?
Ritchel, if I may add, what are the on-the-ground stories you're hearing from the indigenous peoples? How is climate change affecting them directly, and how are they trying to adjust to the changing climate?
As for the Nabaoinons, in the context of the locality, the Nabaoy River watershed, the climate crisis are, yes, as Sir Ronald mentioned earlier, the flash floods, the landslides, the exposed routes, uprooted trees, flooded roads and houses, damaged riverbanks, soil erosions, and siltations. These are among the observable climate crises regularly faced by the Nabaoinons. And we in Team Bintuwak believes that Nabaoy is a frontline community and is closest to the problem, and at the same time, closest to the solution. As for the local community, the Nabaoinons, they are amenable of, or they believe that the changing of their landscapes and the effects on their livelihoods are brought by climate change, though they lack the full context of the knowledge, but they know about climate change. And for example, they have demonstrated adaptive fishing tools like sungya. They developed it. They developed such sungya as fish and river catching tools during floods, which we observe are important traditional techniques that can be adopted by other local communities, as long as they will be brought on the table, and we will learn from these locals who are into adaptations. And also, since there is a degrading resource from or on their mountainous areas. For example, the source of their material for their taon or their fish traps, they can no longer go up in the mountains because of the changing climate, which affected the adaptability and the familiarity of the people. Mostly the young people are the ones going up, and many local people, the older ones are they are apprehensive of sending their kids up to the mountains because of the unpredictable flash flood these days. So they have adapted it into a pet bottle. So the fish traps now, they have changed it to pet bottles. So those are the actual scenarios that we have observed in the community. And upon checking their forest cover, because we're trying to figure out why sometimes, even if it's dry season, or if it's not raining, there's flash flood. Richard usually goes up to the mountainous part to check on the forest cover, and I think Richard has something that he found out recently, which part of the watershed has been degraded.
Okay, thanks, Ritchel. So interesting. You actually kind of went reef to ridge, impacts from flooding, and it's also connection to the mountainous areas. Robert, what's the story of climate change there in southern Bukidnon? What are you experiencing in terms of impacts, and what are you trying to do as a community to adjust?
Okay. Yeah. So basically, ang pagkain talaga yung apektado sa amin. Oo, unang-una. Pangalawa ay ang spirituality. Like for example, may area dito sa amin, may mga sapa dito sa amin na kapag tag-init ng isang buwan, natutuyo na. At kapag umuulan naman, lumalakas yung tubig at may kasamang mga lupa, nag-soil degradation na. So ito ay ilan lamang sa epekto ng climate change na dala din ng mga factor na yung pagtatrabaho ng mga tao sa paligid nito gamit yung makabagong sistema ng pagsasaka. So ito yung isa sa mga dahilan na nakikita ko na problema na makapagbigay dagdag doon, makapalala sa climate change na usapin. Nais ko lang din parang idagdag kanina sa sinasabi nila about doon sa adaptation ng community. Sa aming area, dito sa Bukidnon, yung adaptation ng ginawa ng community ay yung pagbabago, yung pagbalik sa, hindi ito adaptation na masasabi ko, ngunit ito yung ginawa na yung pagbalik sa traditional na sistema ng pagsasaka. Kasi ang problema kasi sa ngayon na ang parang yung food system natin, yung agrikultura natin na sektor, ito yung isa sa mga dahilan na kung bakit yung mga tao sa upland community, kahit na sa mga step na mga areas na ay ginagawa pa rin nila na sakahan ng mais. Kasi ito yung demand sa baba. So, kung adaptation yung sasabihin, yung pag-uusapan, may adaptation sa larangan ng kailangan ng pera ng mga tao, ginagawa nila ito. Pero in terms sa adaptation, dun kung paano natin i-adapt yung klima sa pagbabago ng panahon, ito yung pagbabalik sa traditional na paraan ng pagsasaka. So kaya sa aming grupo is sinisikapan namin na maituro balik sa kanila or kumusta sila kung pinapractice pa ba nila itong mga nakagawian ng mga nakakatanda. So I think yun yung parang importante na malaman din natin yung kung bakit kung ano yung epekto ng climate change dito at ano yung nangyayari talaga sa komunidad at paano yung mga communities kung paano sila nag-respond at baka yung solution is nandun lang sa traditional na paraan. So isa yan sa aming tinitignan na posible na maging balikan.
Si Robert mentioned food and spirituality as being part of what is affecting them now, how climate change affects them. Doc Lenny, in your studies, how big a role does spirituality play in terms of indigenous communities' ability to adjust to change?
I think much of I think spirituality has to do with the connection to the place, because for most indigenous communities, where they are is not just for them a place where they live, they get their food, but it's also a place where really they can experience their full spirituality, where they can get their strength. And I think that if they can hold on to that, they will be able to really work on doing more positive things in their community. Because like what Robert said, if that's lost, there might not be motivation anymore in remaining in that place. And that would lead to, migration of our indigenous communities to other places, and then resulting to more issues that they will be experiencing, and problems and issues in another place.
Thanks, Doc Lenny. Ritchel, among the Nabaoynons, are you seeing this running theme also of the importance of spirituality?
Oh, yes. This is something that Sir Ronald is very particular about, because the way he translated it from his science perspective to us people on the ground, the more the local community, or the Nabaoynons in particular, cling on to their taboos, their norms, like they value a certain old tree because they believe a spirit lives there. They don't go fishing on certain period of time, on a particular time of the day, or on a particular day in a week, because of their belief systems. These values are very important for conservation. They are considered as modern conservation toolkit, as Sir Ronald conveys to us, and I think he can expound on this particular issue.
Sige, Sir Ronald, before we try to go back to Robert.
Okay, now this is a very interesting conversation, because I have the same conversation when I presented my work early 3 months ago in Prague during the European Conservation Biology Conference as part of my work with OML about the impact of religion on indigenous knowledge. Now, I would like to say that spiritually, if not religion, is really the overarching theme of indigenous knowledge. Now, with the understanding that religion in the Philippines, Catholic or any other religion, is actually an amalgamation of that imported religion with local traditional knowledge such as, animism and other traditional belief. For example, in Nabaoy River, there are many social taboos that are being followed by the local inhabitants in the context of their fishing and how they conduct socially. And people are expected to actually follow this. One of this, as mentioned by Ritchel, is that during Tuesdays and Fridays, people believe that more evil spirits are active during these days, especially during noontime, such that they are prohibited to go out fishing. Now, how can you translate this in terms of conservation? Now, 2 days a week that they are not fishing is comparable to temporal reserves, temporal management, where fishing are not allowed, like closed season in traditional fisheries management. Traditional people also believe that they should not be fishing close to big trees. As Ma'am Noralene had mentioned, this is very site-specific because they have sacred places characterized by big rocks, and they are not allowed to fish in this area. Again, this is connected to their belief that these areas are the habitat, the temple of good spirits. And again, we contextualize this into fisheries management so that we can use as policy. Such kind of belief is similar to spatial management measures like marine protected areas or natural parks, which policy should capitalize so that the implementation of regulation will be easily policed, because people will already follow it because it integrates what they believe as sacred into something that is respected by the policy. Very interesting. Again, this is related to religion because they believe in the spirits, good spirits, bad spirits, connected to spirituality in general. Another good example, which is very good, probably unique in Abaoy, is their traditional belief not to cook invertebrates such as crabs and shrimps. People should not grill it with these crabs and shrimps because they believe that if you're gonna eat it through grilling or sugba, it will produce illness. Now, how can you interpret this? Now, this is, not eating invertebrates without scales, for example, can be traced back to the Old Testament, and then not grilling during special days in a year can be connected to the traditional belief that is connected to Catholicism during Holy Week, not grilling. So, we have to connect this because all this is a manifestation of belief that is being adapted over, generation of existence. So that's our take for Nabaoy.
Thank you. And with that, let's try to go back to the person who first started this venture into spirituality. Robert, can you expound on your experience in the community on climate change and spirituality?
So halimbawa, may tinatawag din kami na panuig at saka pangulilang. Ito yung sa pagsasaka. Dahil nga nagbabago na yung panahon natin, ang mga magsasaka, wala na silang tinitignan na cycle sa pagtatanim nila. Kasi ang pag-interpret ng mga magsasaka sa resulta ng climate change ay okay naman kasi umulan naman, or hindi naman natin alam yung panahon, baka uulan, so magtatanim tayo ngayon. So dati kasi sa traditional na pagsasaka is yun na nga, inaalam natin kung kailan yung anong buwan yung magandang itanim ng mais, ng upland rice, ng mga adlay, kung ano rin mga buwan na kung kailan dapat itatanim yung mga root crops natin. So ang nangyari ngayon, dahil nga nagbabago na yung panahon, yung mga magsasaka natin, hindi natin nila tinitingnan yung cycle ng pagtatanim. So apektado nito yung paniniwala natin, yung spirituality ng mga manubo kasi nagbago na yung panahon. Yung panahon, yung ritual na ginagawa dapat sa ito na buwan, sa ito na panahon, ay yun lang dapat. Sa ngayon, yun yung nakakalungkot na dahil nga sa nagbabago na, paunti-unti na yun na, yung about sa religion din kanina, na parang paunti-unti na nililimot, nakakalimutan na. Dahil nga, doon nga sa tingin ko, yung epekto ng pagbabago ng panahon natin.
Salamat, Robert. There's really, this discussion has really become more deeper than I thought we would go into. We are discussing culture in indigenous communities. We are surfacing not just climate impacts, but also how it impacts spirituality and vice versa. One of the things that surprises me is a lot of what you're giving me as examples would actually be considered nature-based solutions, which is a very popular term these days, trying to surface nature-based solutions. Perhaps one second to the last question for our panel. What are communities doing now to try and solve or act on climate change in terms of the impacts on the community? Robert mentioned we have a case of too little water and too much water. How are you trying to adjust to these changes, Robert?
So paano namin ina-adjust ito? So sa mga program namin, paano yung nag-adjust yung community? Kasi nakikita natin na kahit na nandito na yung problema, ito yung realidad talaga sa community. Kahit nandito na ang problema, hindi nila ito nakikita. So ang magiging role namin doon ay makikipag-usap sa kanila na ganito at doon namin ipapasok yung programa namin na farm boundary management, farm boundary regeneration. Doon kami magtatanim ng mga puno sa mga critical na areas. At kung tanungin talaga ako about kung paano in-adapt ng community, kung sila lang mismo sa level nila ay iba yung pananaw nila sa usaping ito. So kailangan talaga na mayroong magli-lead sa kanila or mag-guide at ipapaalala sa kanila na kung hangga't maaari, tingnan natin kung ano yung magiging epekto nito. So para sa akin, sasagutin ko yan sa honest na paraan na yung adaptation na sinasabi natin kanina is medyo malayo talaga dun sa nangyayari sa komunidad dito sa amin. Oo. Kasi hangga't hindi natin na nakakausap or hangga't walang hindi mismo manggaling sa may kapangyarihan yung decision sa nangyayari sa ngayon, hindi yun magiging epektibo dito sa ating mga komunidad.
Thanks, Robert. Siguro we can end this panel. We've talked about the positives of learning from indigenous communities and how they adjust to climate, but we're also surfacing challenges. Siguro for each one of you, given the certainty of climate change, what future do you envision for our indigenous communities?
Okay, ako na siguro mauna. Okay. Isa lang sa pinapangarap ng komunidad, na gusto ko sa komunidad ay makita ng komunidad balik yung kaimportante ng komunidad, ng pag-uugali ng mga tao, ng relasyon natin sa kapwa, relasyon natin sa lupa, relasyon natin sa tubig, sa biodiversity. So dapat makita ito at maturuan natin yung susunod na mga kabataan na ganito ang pagpapahalaga natin sa ating lupang kinagisnan. Yun naman po.
Salamat, Robert. Team Bintuwak, what say you?
May sasabihin lang po ako. This is connected to what Ma'am Noralene mentioned. I think her presentation was an excellent presentation covering a lot of things, as well as what mentioned by Robert about to nature. But first, on the technical side, dito sa climate change narrative, at least in the Philippines. Now, we have the Climate Change Commission, and most literature and most conversation and narrative that I heard is focused more on adaptation. Adaptation is a reaction with the understanding that that event is inevitable. What we should focus more, at least in the Philippines, should be more about mitigation, stopping that event rather than adapting from the fact. Now, if you look at the budget of climate change, only around 20% are allocated for mitigation and 80% out of yearly 20 million is for adaptation. Second, with the understanding that the UNESCO, UNEP, many international organizations, probably through NCCA in the Philippines, acknowledge the importance of indigenous knowledge systems in terms of increasing the resiliency on the impact of climate change. But there is this big gap of appreciation and actually utilizing indigenous knowledge in terms of policy. Final words when it comes to this is with the understanding that traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge system are tied to and connected to the natural capital. When I say traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge system, we are talking about the traditional belief, their rituals, their language, and these are all connected to the natural capital. For example, in the Baoy River, their spirituality and traditional belief are tied to their sacred places along the Nabawi River. And with the advent of introduction of water dam in the Nabawi River, at the same time, the impact of climate change, all these sacred places will be disappearing or are disappearing now. And their custom and tradition are tied to this, and such that there is this risk in the future that such belief system will also disappear, at least in the context of Nabawi. One important thing is, for example, their traditional indigenous herbal medicine are tied to disappearing plant biodiversity. Now, extinction is one indirect repercussion of climatic change, and with extinction events of various animals and plants which are connected again to the traditional knowledge system, what we can expect in the future if this remains unmitigated is that there would be disruption or disappearance of all this traditional belief that is being nurtured for generations in the context of the disappearance of this natural system. So how can the community face and what should be the adaptive mechanism and mitigation scenarios that we should be doing? I think that's a very hard answer. That's a very hard question to answer, and probably Ma'am Noralene, or probably I would like to hear more about OML on what should be done in terms of preserving this traditional ecological knowledge amidst this climate change. Now, I'm going back to this as what Robert have mentioned, because at the end of the day, what matters to these local indigenous people, at least in the context of Nabawi or in the context of Malalisan Island, is that they can bring in food to the table. Now, my very simple practical answer probably is that the government should enhance job security or livelihood multiplicity on all these vulnerable communities, because, you know, survival is what really matters now. And we can only ensure this by having these people sustainable livelihood, you know, amidst the disappearing biodiversity.
I hope yung ating mga policymakers, given our research, so dapat they will focus on how to protect those forests kasi the climate change it will happen eh. So parang unti-unti nararamdaman na natin yung effect. So at least pag may mga puno doon sa taas, mababawasan yung extent ng damage sa baba.
As for me, my hope for Nabaoinons being one of the ecological reserves of the Northwest Panay Peninsula and of Boracay Island, because I want to mention that Boracay Island is very known worldwide, and it cannot continue being a crown jewel of our country without safeguarding the source of its water. Okay, so the main source of the potable water supply in Boracay Island is the Nabaoy River watershed. And so I hope that this will ring a bell to our policymakers who have been very focused on generating income from Boracay Island, but seems for us who have focused on Nabaoy River watershed as for this research, the Nabaoinons as stewards and the watershed have been neglected. It had not been in the front line of conservation. And I really hope that in the future, there will be no war on water in Nabaoy, in Malay, and in Panay Island. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritchel. And now I turn to Doc Lenny. I don't know how you're going to answer this given the amount of research you've done on IPs, but if you could try, what future and hope do you have for indigenous communities and preserving their culture?
So I'm coming in from the perspective of being a risk reduction practitioner. So the dream basically, of course, would be a resilient, sustainable future for our indigenous communities, as what we would also aspire for all the excluded and vulnerable groups. So the conversation now is not only a matter of us not leaving them behind, but more importantly, really on having or giving indigenous communities a seat on the table and letting their voices be heard. So like we hear in many of discussions on inclusion of late, so they would say that now it's nothing about us without us. So we need to engage them for them to be able to contribute more on resilience building and climate actions that would bring benefits to their community.
Thank you, everyone. We started out this conversation trying to simply correlate climate change and our culture, especially our indigenous cultures. And what we're finding is how sense and pride of place can help strengthen adaptive capacities, not just of these communities, but also of other communities. We can learn from each other and enable action with each other. Nature-based solutions, which is a big buzzword in the climate change space these days, can be found in many traditional practices observed by indigenous communities. There's also much to learn about trying to balance traditions with modernization towards sustainable development. We've only looked at a handful of examples of stories of indigenous communities in this episode. And there are many, many more stories of vulnerability and adaptation and connection. I hope we can continue to surface, document, and discuss how these communities are being impacted, how they are adapting and thriving, because there is still much more to learn about indigenous communities. And it's not just about a story of vulnerability. So we would like to thank our esteemed guests for this episode, for the Kwentong Kultura episode, Dr. Noralene Uy of the International Recovery Platform Secretariat, Ronald Maliao, Richard Cahilig, and Ritchel Cahilig of Team Bintuwak, and Robert Mansalo-on Cahapon of Salumayag Youth Collective for Forests.